The courtroom went silent in a way that felt almost dangerous. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the soft shuffle of papers, and then, boom, a sharp bang of the gavel that echoed off the walls. The judge's face had turned a deep shade of red, his patience clearly pushed to its limit. Everyone in the gallery leaned forward. Something had just gone very wrong. Pam Bondi had broken courtroom protocol. No one expected it. She had built her reputation as a composed, strategic, and calculated attorney, someone who understood not just the law, but the rhythm of a courtroom. She wasn't known for reckless emotion. She was known for precision, control, timing. But on this particular day, something shifted. As the defense attorney was speaking confidently to the jury, laying out what sounded like a carefully crafted narrative, Bondi suddenly rose from her seat, without being recognized by the judge, and began to speak over him. Gasps filled the room. A few members of the gallery exchanged stunned looks. One juror's eyebrows shot up. Even the court reporter hesitated for half a second, unsure whose words to capture first. Courtroom rules are strict for a reason. You don't interrupt. You don't speak out of turn. And you definitely don't challenge the process mid-argument. There's a structure to everything. Objections, responses, rulings. It's a system built on order. Without it, everything falls apart. The judge slammed his gavel again. "Counselor, you will wait your turn," he thundered, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The sound echoed, hard, final. The tension was immediate, thick, uncomfortable. For a split second, it looked like Bondi might sit down. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. Her jaw tightened. The defense attorney paused dramatically, glancing toward the jury as if to say, "See, this is what we're dealing with." But instead of backing down, instead of apologizing and sinking quietly into her chair, Bondi did something that stunned everyone even more. She kept talking. "Your Honor, I must address what was just stated." "Counselor," the judge interrupted sharply, "you will respect this court." There was steel in his voice now. Most attorneys would have stopped right there. The threat didn't even need to be spoken. Everyone in that room understood what was at stake. Fines, sanctions, even contempt of court. No lawyer wants to be seen as disrespectful to the bench. But Bondi's expression wasn't defiant. It wasn't emotional. It was urgent. She wasn't speaking loudly. She wasn't shouting. But her words carried weight. "Your Honor, the jury has just heard a statement that directly contradicts this court's prior ruling." That sentence changed everything. The defense immediately objected, accusing her of grandstanding and attempting to disrupt their closing argument. The judge looked ready to explode again. His fingers tightened around the gavel. "You are out of order," he warned. But Bondi didn't raise her voice. Instead, she did something subtle yet powerful. She shifted her tone from confrontation to clarity. "I understand the procedure, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "But if I wait until rebuttal, the damage may already be done." The courtroom fell into a strange, suspended silence. Because now this wasn't just about interrupting, it was about whether something improper had just occurred. The defense attorney scoffed and shook his head, calling her claim dramatic speculation. But several jurors were now looking back and forth between the two attorneys, clearly aware that something significant was unfolding. The judge leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "Be very careful, counselor," he said slowly. Bondi nodded once. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't posturing. She was focused. Moments earlier, the defense had referenced a piece of evidence that had been ruled inadmissible during a pre-trial hearing. They hadn't stated it directly. They hadn't crossed the line clearly, but they had danced right along the edge of it, just enough to plant a suggestion in the minds of the jury. And Bondi knew how powerful suggestion could be. Trials aren't just about facts. They're about perception, about what sticks in a juror's mind long after the words are spoken. If that implication lingered, even for a few minutes, it could shape how the jury interpreted everything else. That was the risk she was trying to stop. But in doing so, she had violated one of the most sacred rules of the courtroom: wait your turn. The judge's patience was visibly strained. The courtroom air felt heavier by the second. "Counselor," he said firmly, "this court will not tolerate disorder." Every eye was on her now. The jury, the gallery, the opposing counsel. Bondi straightened her posture. "I apologize for speaking out of turn," she said carefully, "but I could not remain silent if the integrity of this proceeding was at stake." And just like that, the tension shifted. It wasn't gone, But it had changed. Because now the question wasn't simply whether she broke protocol. The question was whether she had broken it for a reason. And in that charged, silent courtroom, everyone waited to see which would matter more, procedure or justice. To understand why this moment was so explosive, you have to understand courtroom protocol. It's not just about politeness. It's about order. Every word spoken in a courtroom is recorded. Every objection follows a structure. There's a rhythm to it, a carefully balanced back and forth where each side gets its moment, and the judge acts as the gatekeeper of fairness. And Pam Bondi had just disrupted that rhythm. In a courtroom, timing is everything. Attorneys wait to be recognized before speaking. They stand when addressing the bench. They phrase objections in precise legal language. Even emotion is measured and controlled. The system works because everyone agrees to follow the same rules. But this was different. The defense attorney looked irritated, his confidence briefly cracking as he glanced toward the bench. The jury looked confused, some shifting in their seats. A few exchanged uncertain glances, clearly sensing the tension but unsure of its cause. Even the court reporter paused for half a second, fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure whose voice to prioritize. The judge leaned forward slowly, his expression hardening. "This is not how this court operates," he said sternly. "You will follow procedure." His tone wasn't loud this time. It was controlled, and somehow that made it more intimidating. Normally, that's the end of it. Lawyers know when to pull back. Courtrooms are built on hierarchy. When the judge speaks, you listen. When you're warned, you comply. But Bondi's expression told a different story. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't embarrassed. There was no sign of panic in her eyes. Instead, there was focus. Sharp, unwavering focus. She was determined. "Your Honor," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "If I wait, critical information may never be heard." That statement sent a ripple through the courtroom. Critical information? Why now? The jury's attention snapped fully back to her. The defense attorney stiffened, clearly sensing that whatever she was about to say could undermine the argument he had just carefully constructed. The defense immediately objected, accusing her of theatrics and attempting to derail the proceedings. He argued that she was trying to distract the jury from the strength of his case. He called it a calculated disruption. But Bondi stood her ground. She claimed the opposing side had just introduced a misleading narrative, subtle but powerful. According to her, a statement made moments earlier implied the existence of evidence that had already been ruled inadmissible. It wasn't a direct violation, it was more like a suggestion, a seed planted carefully in the minds of the jury. And in trials, suggestions can be dangerous. Because once an idea enters a juror's mind, it's nearly impossible to erase. Even if a judge instructs them to disregard something, the human brain doesn't simply forget. Bondi knew that. That's why she was willing to break protocol. The judge's patience was clearly wearing thin. His fingers tapped lightly against the bench, a subtle sign of mounting frustration. "Counselor," he warned, his voice low and deliberate, "one more interruption and you will be held in contempt." That word, contempt, landed heavily. Contempt of court isn't just a slap on the wrist. It can mean fines. It can mean damage to a professional reputation. In extreme cases, it can even mean jail time. For an attorney of Bondi's stature, such a ruling could follow her long after this trial ended. You could feel everyone holding their breath. The gallery had gone completely still. The jurors' faces were tense, their eyes moving between the bench and the attorneys like spectators at a high-stakes match. The defense attorney folded his arms, almost daring her to continue. Would she risk it? Would she push further and defy the court openly? Bondi paused. For the first time since she stood up, she seemed to weigh the gravity of the moment. Her shoulders rose slightly as she took a measured breath. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. And then she spoke again. But this time, her tone shifted. Not louder, not sharper, clearer. "Your Honor," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I fully respect this court. But if the jury is allowed to deliberate under a mistaken impression, the integrity of this trial could be compromised." There it was. She wasn't arguing for herself. She wasn't trying to score a dramatic point. She was framing her interruption as a defense of the process itself. The defense objected again, more forcefully this time. He insisted there was no violation, no implication, no wrongdoing. He accused her of attempting to create confusion where none existed. But confusion was already there. The jurors' faces showed it. And the judge saw it too. His expression shifted ever so slightly, from anger to contemplation. Because now, This wasn't just about discipline. It was about whether something improper had just slipped into the room under the cover of polished rhetoric. The courtroom remained frozen in that fragile moment, balanced between order and chaos. One more word from Bondi could trigger punishment. One more word from the judge could silence her completely. And as the tension tightened like a drawn wire, everyone waited to see which would prevail: authority or urgency. The breaking point came seconds later. The defense attorney resumed speaking, attempting to continue as if nothing had happened. His voice carried a forced calm, but there was an edge to it now, a subtle sharpness that hadn't been there before. He spoke deliberately, as though trying to reestablish control of the room, to pull the jury's attention back to his version of events. But the tension hadn't disappeared. It was still there, tight, unsettled. And then Pam Bondi rose again. "Your Honor, this cannot wait." Her voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. That was it. The judge exploded. "I have warned you," he shouted, striking the gavel so hard it seemed like it might crack under the force. The sound echoed violently against the wooden panels. "This court will not descend into chaos because of grandstanding." The word grandstanding hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't just a reprimand, it was an accusation. A declaration that she wasn't defending justice, she was performing for attention. For a courtroom attorney, especially one with years of public experience, that word carried weight. It questioned her integrity, her motives, her professionalism. For a brief moment, it felt like everything might spiral out of control. The judge leaned forward, his patience fully exhausted now. He began listing potential consequences in a firm, deliberate tone. Fines for disrupting proceedings, formal sanctions placed on the record, even the possibility of removal from the courtroom if the behavior continued. Removal. That word landed heavily. The idea that an attorney could be ordered out in front of the jury was unthinkable. It would send a message far louder than any argument made during the trial. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but reporters seated in the back row scribbled furiously, their pens racing across notepads. They knew this was no ordinary courtroom disagreement. This was headline material. The gallery whispered nervously. A few spectators shook their heads. Others leaned closer, straining to hear every word. And the jury? They avoided eye contact. Some stared down at their notes. Others fixed their eyes straight ahead, as if pretending none of this was happening. But their body language told a different story. Shoulders tense, brows furrowed, hands clasped tightly together. They were witnessing something rare, open conflict between the bench and an attorney. The defense attorney stood silently now, almost satisfied, as if the eruption confirmed his earlier claim that Bondi was being theatrical. For a split second, it looked like she might respond with equal force. Her shoulders were squared. Her expression was intense. The air felt charged, like a lightning strike was seconds away. And then, in a twist no one expected, she did something completely different. She stopped arguing. She slowly lowered her hands to the table. Her posture relaxed. The sharpness in her expression softened. When she spoke again, her voice was calm. Not defiant, not defensive. Calm. "Your Honor," she began, measured and steady. "I apologize for raising my voice." The shift was immediate. The judge blinked, caught slightly off guard by the sudden change in tone. The courtroom quieted. "I do not intend to disrupt this court," she continued. "And I certainly do not intend to disrespect it." There was no sarcasm, no edge, just clarity. She took a breath before continuing. "But I believe the jury has just heard a statement that risks undermining a prior ruling. If I am wrong, I accept the court's correction. But if I am right, then allowing that statement to stand, even temporarily, could compromise the fairness of these proceedings." Her words weren't loud anymore. They didn't need to be. They carried weight because of their restraint. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably. The judge's grip on the gavel loosened slightly. The room felt different now. Instead of confrontation, there was consideration. Instead of chaos, there was focus. Bondi wasn't fighting for dominance. She wasn't challenging authority. She was reframing the moment, not as a personal clash, but as a question of fairness. "Your Honor," she added quietly, "my concern is not about winning an argument. It's about ensuring that the jury deliberates on facts properly before them." That line changed everything. The judge leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. The anger that had flared moments earlier began to fade into something more analytical. Because now the issue wasn't about volume or timing, it was about substance. The courtroom remained completely silent. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed distant. After a long pause, the judge spoke, this time without shouting. Approach. Both attorneys stepped toward the bench for a side discussion, their voices lowered out of the jury's hearing. The reporters strained to catch any visible cues. The gallery waited anxiously. No one knew how it would end. Would the judge issue a formal sanction? Would he dismiss her concern entirely? Or would he acknowledge that her interruption, however improper, had a valid foundation? As Bondi stood there, composed and steady, one thing was clear. She had risked everything in that moment. Her reputation, her standing in the court, even her credibility before the jury. But by lowering her voice instead of raising it, by choosing humility over defiance, she had shifted the tone of the entire room. And now, the decision rested not on emotion, but on the facts. Instead of firing back, instead of escalating the confrontation, Pam Bondi took a slow, steady breath. The entire courtroom seemed to notice it. Her shoulders lowered slightly. The tension in her jaw eased. When she spoke again, her voice was no longer sharp or urgent. It was controlled, grounded. Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, but I will accept any consequence if it means protecting the integrity of this trial. Silence. Not the uncomfortable silence from moments before. This was different. It was the kind of silence that follows a statement no one expected. She wasn't defiant anymore. She wasn't interrupting. She wasn't trying to overpower the room. She was calm, almost solemn. There was no performance in her tone, no attempt to win sympathy from the jury. It sounded sincere. Even the defense attorney, who had been ready to object again, hesitated for a fraction of a second. Bondi continued. She explained, clearly and methodically, that a key piece of evidence referenced moments earlier had already been ruled inadmissible during a prior hearing. The ruling had been firm. The jury was not to hear about it. Not directly, not indirectly, not even implied. But according to her, the defense had done something subtle. They hadn't named the evidence outright. They hadn't blatantly violated the court's order. Instead, they had carefully worded their argument in a way that hinted at its existence, just enough to plant a question in the jurors' minds. And in a courtroom, a planted question can be powerful. If the jury connects those dots, she said carefully, they may assume there is supporting evidence that they have not seen. That assumption could shape how they interpret every fact that follows. Her words were measured. She wasn't attacking the defense attorney personally. She wasn't accusing him of intentional misconduct. She was focusing on the effect, not the motive. I spoke out of turn, she admitted openly, but I could not stay silent. That admission carried weight. It takes confidence to interrupt a court. It takes even more to acknowledge it plainly. The shift in the room was immediate. The judge's anger didn't disappear, but it softened. His posture changed. He leaned back slightly instead of forward. Instead of seeing rebellion, he now saw urgency. Instead of hearing defiance, he heard concern. He removed his glasses slowly and looked directly at her. "Clarify your position," he said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Bondi didn't rush. She walked through the argument step by step. She referenced the exact language the defense had used moments earlier. She pointed out how certain phrases mirrored descriptions from the excluded evidence. She cited the earlier ruling by date and summarized its limitations. There was no emotion in her explanation now, just precision. She spoke like someone presenting a checklist. Point 1, Point 2, Point 3. The defense objected again, arguing that her interpretation was exaggerated and that their statement was entirely permissible. His voice rose slightly, but this time the judge didn't let him build momentum. "Enough," the judge said firmly, raising his hand. The word cut through the room. The defense attorney stopped mid-sentence. For the first time since the confrontation began, the judge wasn't reacting emotionally. He was evaluating. He reached for his notes. The soft rustling of paper seemed unusually loud in the otherwise silent courtroom. Every person present watched him, waiting for a sign, a hint, any clue about which way this might go. The jury remained still, their attention fixed on the bench. Reporters in the back leaned forward. The judge reviewed the transcript from the earlier hearing. He scanned highlighted sections. He compared them to what had just been said in court. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like hours. No one dared to speak. Even the air seemed heavy. Finally, the judge looked up. His expression was serious, but no longer heated. "The court will take a brief recess." That was it. No ruling, no reprimand, no immediate decision, just a pause. But that pause meant everything. Whispers erupted the moment he stood and exited through the side door. The gallery buzzed with speculation. Some believed Bondi had overstepped and would face sanctions. Others wondered if she had just exposed a serious problem in the defense's argument. The jury was escorted out quietly, their faces unreadable. The defense attorney gathered his papers stiffly, clearly unsettled. Bondi returned to her seat without celebration, without visible relief. She simply sat down, folded her hands, and stared straight ahead. She had taken a risk, a significant one. If the judge ruled against her, she would appear reckless in front of the jury. If he ruled in her favor, it would validate her interruption, but only after a public clash with the bench. The outcome was uncertain. But one thing was undeniable. The entire trajectory of the trial now hung in the balance. And as the courtroom emptied into the hallway, buzzing with tension and unanswered questions, everyone knew they had just witnessed something rare. A moment where procedure and principle collided, and no one yet knew which would prevail. When the judge returned, the atmosphere had completely changed. The low hum of conversation that had filled the courtroom during the recess disappeared the moment the side door opened. Everyone rose instinctively. The jurors filed back in, their expressions serious. Reporters tightened their grip on pens. Even the defense attorney seemed less certain than before. And at the prosecution table, Pam Bondi sat upright, composed, hands folded neatly in front of her. The judge took his seat. His voice, when he spoke, was measured now, controlled, deliberate, stripped of the anger that had erupted earlier. After reviewing the record, he began, glancing briefly at his notes. The court finds that the prosecution's concern was not without merit. A collective murmur spread across the room. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The judge continued before anyone could react further. While counsel did violate courtroom protocol by interrupting and speaking out of turn, he said firmly, the matter she raised required immediate clarification. The words hung in the air. Required immediate clarification. That single phrase reframed the entire confrontation. The judge went on to explain that the statement made by the defense had indeed approached the boundary of a prior ruling. Though it did not directly violate the court's order, it risked creating an inference about evidence that had already been deemed inadmissible. And in a jury trial, inference can be just as powerful as fact. To ensure fairness, the judge continued, the jury will receive a specific instruction to disregard any implication related to the previously excluded material. The jurors listened carefully. A few nodded almost imperceptibly. The defense attorney's frustration was visible now. His jaw tightened. He shuffled his papers sharply, clearly unhappy with the outcome. He had nearly regained control of the courtroom narrative, and in a matter of minutes, it had shifted again. But the judge wasn't finished. He turned his attention directly to Bondi. "Counselor," he said, his tone firm but no longer heated. "This court expects professionalism at all times. Interruptions and raised voices undermine the structure that allows this system to function." A pause. "However," he added, "the integrity of the proceedings is paramount." There it was. Not praise, but not punishment either.
The message was clear. The rules matter, but so does justice. Bondi rose slightly from her chair. "Understood, Your Honor," she replied calmly. No celebration, no visible relief, just acknowledgement. And in that brief exchange, something subtle yet powerful happened. The confrontation that had once seemed like open conflict now felt like a test, one that had clarified rather than damaged the court's authority. The jury was instructed carefully. The judge explained that their verdict must be based solely on properly admitted evidence, and that any suggestion otherwise must be disregarded entirely. The trial resumed, but the energy had shifted. Before the interruption, the courtroom had felt predictable, structured, controlled. Now, there was an undercurrent of heightened awareness. Every word spoken carried extra weight. Every argument felt more deliberate. The defense attorney chose his phrasing more cautiously. Bondi, for her part, returned to her composed, strategic style, waiting to be recognized before speaking, standing only when appropriate, her tone measured and precise. It was as if both sides understood that the margin for error had narrowed. What began as a dramatic confrontation had ended as something else entirely, a reminder of how high the stakes truly were. This wasn't about personalities. It wasn't about ego. It was about the responsibility carried by everyone in that room. Outside the courtroom, as the day's session adjourned, reporters gathered quickly in the hallway. Microphones appeared, cameras flashed, questions flew in rapid succession. Was it worth the risk? Do you regret interrupting the judge? Was this a strategic move? Some commentators later described the moment as reckless, a dangerous gamble that could have backfired. Others called it courageous, a necessary stand to prevent even the slightest unfair advantage. Legal analysts debated whether protocol should ever bend in the face of urgency. Social media lit up with divided opinions. But inside that courtroom, the takeaway felt simpler. One bold interruption had forced everyone, judge, attorneys, jury, and observers, to pause and reconsider what truly mattered. Procedure creates order. Order creates fairness. But fairness itself must always remain the ultimate goal. And sometimes, in rare moments when those principles collide, someone has to make a choice. To stay silent and preserve form, or to speak up and risk consequence. On that day, Bondi chose to speak, and whether viewed as bold or controversial, one thing was undeniable. In a room governed by strict rules and rigid order, a single, deliberate act of defiance reshaped the course of the proceedings. Because sometimes, in the heat of the moment, standing up, even when it breaks the rules, can change everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful, real-life moments that prove calm confidence can change everything.